We are recording. Thank you so much, everyone behind the scenes making this happen. Welcome. We at NVRDC are really excited to bring you today's training in partnership with the Person Center and the National Women's Law Center's Legal Network for Gender Equity team. Part 2 of this series will be on trauma-informed legal interviews and intakes, which you see up here on the slide. And we're really hoping to provide all of you attending today with an overview of trauma-responsive interviewing strategies and techniques that empower clients to fully engage in their legal goals. If you're comfortable, I have the chat pulled up, and Lindsay from my team is helping me take care of the chat here behind the scenes as well. Feel free to let us know if you did attend part 1 of this series. That just gives us a helpful understanding of the baseline that you might be coming in with. As a reminder, part 1 of the series was Trauma 101, Understanding Trauma Impacts and Tools to Support Clients with Trauma Histories. It would just be great to get a sense of the overlap of the attendees from that first part of the series as we move through the various topics in this series together. Yay, I'm seeing some I attended, so that's awesome. Good matriculation. I'm happy to see that. Thanks for those of you who are coming back to join us again. We're really grateful for those of you who were able to join us today. And as a friendly reminder, you should have received a link via email that includes the CLE materials for today's webinar, for those that those are relevant for. That link had slides, bios, the supplemental material, and also the agenda for the day. If you are looking for CLE credit, this is the reminder that after the event today, please fill out that evaluation, the attorney affirmation form available in the link that was provided. That was the email that would have come from Anna Black. And make sure you get those 2 forms and send them back to Jessica Sanchez, who is our CLE provider at HGS. Lindsay, if you have Jessica's email, or if you can pull it up, I don't know that I shared it with you, it's in the chat from last time. Go ahead and put Jessica's email in the chat there. And it looks like it's jsanchez at hsgllp.com for those that may already have it and just want to have that as a reference. Please note that you will receive 1 CLE code today throughout the training, and we will announce that during the presentation just to verify attendance for that CLE credit. I will say it out loud, and Lindsay will go ahead and put it in the chat there for everyone. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. If you all would also be so kind, if you're comfortable, to put your name in your organization affiliation, even your role, if you're comfortable. What I'm specifically looking for is what member of a legal team, what sort of legal team member role do you play? Are you a lawyer, maybe a paraprofessional? Do you do intake or other support staff? It'd be really helpful for us. Feel free to be as specific as you would like, just to get an understanding of who's in the virtual room with us so that we can really orient our delivery to best suit those that are making up our audience today. So I'm getting, yay, it looks like we have, an attorney fellow, very cool. We're doing an LSC fellows training next week on trauma, so that's awesome. Good to see the variety of folks and roles that we have. Paralegal support, awesome. Some administrative roles. Okay. I'm going to try to watch that just to get a sense. So for those of you who did join us for part 1 in this series, we talked a little bit about the science of trauma and really the impact that it has on clients' brains and behaviors. And we kind of did this high-level strategies for consideration when supporting clients with legal goals who have trauma histories. We're going to dive a little bit deeper. You've already, if you joined us for part 1, you're familiar with who I am. I'm Bridget Stump, and I am the Executive Director and have the honor of leading NVRDC in partnership with our amazing staff and board. And Lindsay, my head of services from our team, is here as well. We are going to be bringing that same institutional knowledge and experience that we shared in part 1. And we also are lucky enough today to have Lul joining us as well. And she's one of our critical partners at the Person Center. And thank you so much, Lul, for the important work you do. Feel free to add anything to your introduction for folks who may not have been able to join us for part 1.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm honored to be here, and I apologize ahead of time for background noise as I am traveling with my family. However, I wanted to make sure that I joined on and was able to offer some insight and support. NVRD is a great partner of ours. TPC is a nonprofit that works with domestic violence survivors in the African immigrant community in Washington, D.C. And we work with many partners across different forms and sectors of DV response, and are trying to do what we can to bring culturally specific services to this specific population. So I'll pass it back to Bridget. Thank you.
Yes, and special thanks to Lowell for being sure to be here and add to this fabulous training, given all that you're juggling. Appreciate your time, partnership, and energy, and the perspective that you'll infuse into the discussion. You know, speaking of the discussion today, I do want to highlight that we will mention some examples of harm. Some of those examples will include really difficult topics like sexual violence, and I want to give a clear content warning so folks that are here can just be prepared to take care of yourself, whatever that looks like for you. It's also to explain that I will again use the term victim and survivor interchangeably throughout. As I mentioned before, that's because in the context in which we often operate in the crime victims' rights space, victim is a legal term of art, but of course we would mirror the language of any individual survivor that we're working with. And we'll talk a little bit about language mirroring as a technique, both in intakes and the interview process. With that, I also just wanted to make a note about short and long-term support. I cannot believe that we are already at part 2 in this series. It feels like it just started. Again, special thanks to the National Women's Law Center and the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund for making this series possible. You can catch the last in this 3-part series next Thursday on May 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's where we're going to wrap up the discussion with tools and strategies to minimize trauma impacts within the civil litigation context. As the legal teams prepare clients for depositions, trials, cross-examinations, I'm really excited about that discussion. We'll have some additional presenters that'll be joining us for the first time. And I hope those of you who are interested can join us for the last in this 3-part series next Thursday. So let's jump into what we're here to talk about today. And just quickly, I did want to review that as we learned, the neuroscience of trauma has really taught us a lot more about how clients experience the impact of trauma in their brains, in their behaviors. And we will discuss the overall goal of the interview in the legal context. But really today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the specific and concrete practices that you all hopefully can utilize to create more trauma responsive interviews and intakes for your clients. It's really important to note that this is regardless of what the trauma experience is. We talked in part 1 about how trauma can be either an event, multiple events, or a set of circumstances. So living daily with the impacts of white supremacy, violence, and racism, the impact on clients is not about the legal issue that they are presenting to have you kind of help in your representation, but really we're looking at the totality of their lived experiences, how they interact with the legal systems, and really how we're there navigating it with them. And we as lawyers, as the support staff in the legal team, we can be cues to their prior experiences of trauma that are signaling to them that something is threatening and unsafe, maybe even when that's not the case. So what do we do about that? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We'll just very quickly do a review on trauma and how it's impacting our clients and their engagement with us, all the way from that first conversation in the intake screening process through the interview and preparation process as well. In part 1, we did talk about the data that was pulled from a project specifically funded by the Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime. And that report really detailed these 4 primary ways that we can best support those who've experienced trauma. This was specifically through crime. Again, it's just a helpful example, but it doesn't mean that all trauma exposure is related to victimization. But I use it as an example because, again, we know that clients may be presenting with histories of trauma related to generations of oppression, housing instability, harassment at work, refugee or asylum status, discrimination. There's just an overwhelming amount of ways that clients can be presenting to us for legal assistance that's related to their lived experience and their intersecting ideas. But the basic principle in being trauma responsive and best practices to really mitigate those trauma consequences is the single principles that we are building trust. And we're going to talk a little bit more about trust today. It's one of my favorite things more recently that I've been learning about in the neuroscience of trust, things like oxytocin. And really, it's just doing what we say we're going to do as the helper, whatever role we play in the legal team, but that we honor cultures in these intersecting identities that our clients have, and always center choice and how clients engage with us from the start to the end of our representation. Not surprising when we think about some of the tools we learned about combating the consequences of trauma through agency and choice. And as a quick refresher, there is no one clear-cut definition of what is a trauma experience. That is just simply because trauma is not defined by an event. It is defined by the person who experiences that event. It is generally accepted that when someone has a trauma exposure, that it's because they've been pushed outside of their window of tolerance of stress. And Sandra Bloom, Dr. Sandra Bloom, she has really captured that concept by describing trauma as too much, too fast. And for those who weren't able to be in that kind of trauma foundation setting part 1 discussion, this is just going to give you a little bit of added context here. And I'm summarizing that entire training in just a couple of slides. But the most watered down way to describe trauma activation is that in the initial crisis acute moment represented here on the left of the slide, we're in the limbic system in our brain where we have our amygdala, our hippocampus, and really that amygdala, it does a couple of things. It first signals danger, so that activates our autonomic nervous system, what some of us refer to as adrenaline, all of those physical responses. And then it unconsciously selects fight, flight, freeze, and we'll talk about the 4th new fawn response. And then it stores and recalls those memories differently through what we refer to as a template of danger. So I would just offer for you to think about this if you're out on a hike, it's a beautiful spring day, maybe like today, at least where I'm looking out my window right now, and you hear a little rustle in the leaves and you look over and it's this big brown grizzly bear. I grew up in a part of the country where we actually had grizzly bears, so I know what that experience could feel like. If that were to happen, all of these responses would start to take place in your brain. Your amygdala would signal this feels threatening, dangerous, out of my control, and then you would have both a physical, emotional, paralleled response to that fear activation. But thanks to our hippocampus, our trauma response impacts us much more long-term than just that single event. If we survive that encounter with the bear, our brain takes a little snapshot, and then it creates this template of danger that really only requires about 10 to 20% overlap. So what it does is it allows us to feel safe when we have or safe in a plan when we might experience similar events that remind us of that past danger. So if I'm out on a beautiful spring day and the weather feels just like it did when I ran into that bear, that may be enough of an overlap for me to just kind of look around and double check. My brain thinks something here may not be safe. If I hear the rustling of those leaves, just like I did right before the bear came out from the trees, that sound itself might make my brain in other moments feel like I need to be aware for perceived oncoming danger. It does not have to be a significant overlap. But what we know is that long-term, this ability to be very hypersensitive to interpret danger and places for survival where they may not even really exist, it can really be disruptive on someone's life, because a simple 10 to 20% overlap of past trauma memories can be a cue to danger by sensing something similar, whether that's a smell, a sound, or even someone that looks similar, or the environment in which that danger originally occurred. So this slide here is really meant to capture the totality of the neurobiology of training, that 1.5 hours that many of us, it looks like, spent together. And just to summarize for our purposes today, I wanted to highlight these 3 responses that we know happen when someone has a real traumatic exposure, or even this perceived response to what they think is presenting as a potential trauma exposure. The physical reaction, right? That we know our heart rate gets increased. We have an autonomic nervous system activation that allows us to prepare for the danger of the trauma response. And that can be, we are sensing hyperventilation, fidgeting, sweating, the increased heart rate, and we talked more about that in our first training together. But it's really important to note that this physical response that we do not control out of survival parallels that emotional reaction that mirrors often the fight, flight, or freeze response from our limbic system. And this often emotionally, when we're the observer, presents as something like anger. If someone's mirroring a fight response, it can be shock if they're in that freeze, or fidgeting if someone is having that flight response where they're kind of looking for the door, trying to get out of the room. And externally, acute trauma impacts how the body responds to trauma. Commonly, this is referred to as that fight, flight, or freeze that we've frequently heard referenced. More recent in the research, we talked about how the neurobiology of trauma is actually teaching us about this fourth possible type called the fawn response. For those of you that might often work with child victims of crime in particular, or even represent youth, you might actually, once you learn more about the fawn response, it might sound familiar. We often see it involved in the development of childhood trauma, where a parent or significant authority is the person who's causing the trauma exposure. In those contexts, that often looks, unfortunately, like abuse, physical abuse, or neglect. And children go into this fawn-like response to attempt to avoid the abuse out of survival. So it's a really important fourth response that many are not yet familiar with, that we're still learning about. But we know that trauma impacts our future responses to stress. And we're going to discuss how the impacts really show up in long-term behavior when we are interacting with clients. And how do we build support structures that are equipped to help support them as they're trying to access legal assistance? You know, and another really important factor in trauma response is also how those responding interact with the trauma survivor. The takeaway here is traumatization occurs when both the internal resources in our external responses are not adequate to cope with the threat. And again, that's from Dr. Bloom's research. So we know that there are trauma cues and that those cues activate a trauma response, again, physically, emotionally within the environment. And they can be actual or imagined. So an actual example of a trauma cue could be something like asking an individual who was harmed by another person to identify them. That can be, in our context, we frequently see that either in the courtroom or even in a photo array. So seeing that person for the first time in a picture. But they can also be imagined trauma cues, where the brain is perceiving threats that it's simply thinking about and being reminded of. One really extreme example for me was how trauma cues can come up in proximity to life events. And I worked with a family who lost their only child related to gun violence. And every year around the fall, I would have significant amounts of phone calls from them. I could just tell there was this activated response, a very hypervigilant activated response. And it turned out, once I learned more and kind of understood better these trauma cues, it turned out that it was the proximity to the holidays that was most triggering. Even though their daughter was shot in August, she was born in August, that time of year was the time of year where they were most reminded of the loss of their only child. And it makes sense when I say it out loud. So it's important to recognize that that template of danger that triggers our clients into believing they might be in a threatening environment and activates the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, they can be actual or they can be imagined, and that can be really challenging when we're in the role of a helper. But other examples of common cues is discussing the experience with a paralegal. I saw we have some paraprofessionals, preparing with a pro bono team. Yes, right? We can be the thing that creates this long-term cue that reverts clients back to the trauma response, even days and weeks following the original trauma exposure. So the reality is this makes our jobs actually much harder when we understand this. And we have to be equipped to both identify the manifestations of trauma in our clients' lives and be prepared to respond to it in the moments where it shows up. This is a sort of simplified way to illustrate a pretty complex concept that I really wanted to capture for you all. What we know is that the after effects of trauma are really sinister, and that they are often self-reinforcing. When you experience trauma, often this results and social and relational withdrawal and isolation. So many survivors of trauma will talk about one of the hardest things was learning how to navigate relationships when their concept of trust had shifted. Trauma can result in isolation, and this is often because that is a strategy for predicting future safety. Yet we know that connection is one of the most powerful antidotes in the after effects of trauma. So isolation can be the greatest barrier to accessing ongoing helpful connections that are really necessary for trauma survivors to have these external support systems and to be able to trust them. I think about this all the time in the context of the lawyer-client relationship. And I just wanted the folks that are here to consider how trauma in itself can be an added barrier to developing trust with clients who have those trauma histories, especially when lawyers are often perceived to hold power. And, navigating the consequences of trauma is about shared power. It's about giving power and control back. And so that's just another added challenge that we have to figure out how to navigate. What do we do about that? Well, we can start with tools and strategies that are really centered around client intakes and legal interviews. So a commonplace, unfortunately, that we know lawyers unknowingly can create trauma cues for clients is both during the interview process and also during intakes, right? The frontline folks that are in really intersecting with clients, potential clients, at the earliest point possible. So we look at the framework of an interview for us as a lawyer or really any member of the legal team so that we can understand what are we trying to get out of this experience and how do I accomplish that while also doing it in a trauma-informed way. And when I think about this framework, from my perspective, right, as a lawyer, we're trying to collect data points about our clients' needs, their experience, their goals. We observe how they share data from the conversation that we have with them. But then as humans, we're really trying to assess the delivery of that information. We're looking through our own lens, assumptions, our own biases, and then we try to interpret the information based on all of those things. It's very similar how we have to prepare for how a jury or a judge will use information the way it's delivered to assess someone's credibility. We are doing that in the legal intake and interview process. We all fill in the gaps when there's missing or unclear pieces of information. And this is particularly hard for survivors of trauma because we know those memories are not coming from the linear part of the brain in the frontal lobe cortex. There's actually this really fascinating part of our brain that is literally designed to fill in missing information. And there's been a few articles coming out. It's really tied to sort of the idea of optical illusions and why does our sort of visual pattern get filled in when pieces are missing. But we are designed to fill in missing pieces of information. And this is also true when we're doing client interviews and intakes. And a valid and reliable interview framework actively looks for missing pieces so that we can clarify, we can add in where places are missing, and we can build to a client's narrative and story without inserting our own assumptions that could be inaccurate. So frequently, what is not considered as the purpose of the interview is how it actually functions as a tool for empowering our clients who have trauma experiences and histories. This is kind of my favorite part of the purpose of the interview, because the way it is conducted can actually be an opportunity for choice and empowerment, where the client is given the opportunity to control their narrative, how they share their story. And ultimately, we get to build trust with them in that attorney-client relationship through this process, and really how we create the way the client will experience this process. So my hope is that we view the purpose of the interview first and foremost as a tool to support and empower our clients to be heard and to be validated. Really, again, some of those hallmarks of the best practices in responding to trauma. Lul, anything you would want to add about the interview process before I move on here?
Yeah, all I would really add is that the interview process is, as you've also mentioned, it is a traumatic experience for many of those who have to relive the experience that they've had. But additionally, when we talk about other barriers, it is really important to ensure that accessibility is a priority in the interviews. Many of times, because you want to, I know many times you have to sometimes do the interviews multiple times, but to limit, the amount of challenges, it's important to assess what accessibility looks like for that client. Whether it's language accessibility, whether it's other just better understanding or options in order for them to give the interview in an environment or in a manner that works best for them. That is trauma informed and that is person centered care. And so ensuring that the interview process is just as important to in preparation as it is the execution, then that's a number one piece of advice that I would share.
I think that's such a valid point. And we'll talk a little bit, about kind of the high level purpose of the interview. And we will get into some of those specifics as it relates both to what Lul was mentioning, about the execution, but that preparation piece. And what does a trauma responsive preparation for the interview look like? And the accessibility point, we can't like say that enough. Hopefully that will come out in the thread that you hear when we talk through the before, during, and after parts of a trauma-informed interview. I think it's important for me to say out loud that in order to build a trauma-informed interview framework, we are making a few key assumptions, right? Evidence-based strategies to providing trauma-informed care practices within the healthcare setting have actually really created a good blueprint for us to build from when we're looking at key pillars of trauma-informed practices within the legal services. And really, it starts with these 5 key assumptions that we can make about the best way to serving clients. 1, that we realize there's a widespread impact of trauma and the challenges when we compound trauma consequences because we as the lawyer, the intake staff, the paraprofessional are not equipped to address the ways that trauma creates barriers to accessing legal support, going back to the totality of accessibility. 2, that we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients. This is really a primary focus of the training for part 1 that I see Jennifer and Lindsay have added the recording link into the chat there for folks who weren't able to catch it. But really, this means I don't assume that missing appointments or not returning my phone calls means my client is disengaged. But rather, I understand how trauma can manifest in avoidance, particularly as it's tied to a flight or a freeze reaction. And I ask the question instead of making an assumption about disengagement. 3, we respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, our procedures, and practices. We'll give you kind of a practitioner tip on how you do this with intakes and interviews, but that we're using empowerment techniques to expectation set in every interaction that clients will have with us, even when we will have time-bound pressures and boundaries that we have to set with that client. And 4, that we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. This means not explaining why we are doing something. It's really important when we are going to make a decision or when we're going to ask a question that we're giving information to the client in advance about why, right? Really explaining up front why they're going to experience us in a particular way and making sure that we are always asking for permission. And realizing that if we don't do that, we could actually be compounding the experience of traumatization. This 5th one is actually one that we added in our organization. It's an important part of Lindsay and her team's kind of value in that we trust clients to be the experts of their experiences. So we revisit. We actually go back to clients and ask them, how did you experience this process from start to finish? And get client feedback to better inform how we can improve our trauma responsive care. Lul, anything you would add to some of those assumptions we make about what a trauma-informed approach would look like?
I would definitely add the concept of, re-evaluating. So the interview process for every individual should be different, but every time you conduct those interviews, take the time, whether it's a few minutes, whether it's taking a debrief of some sort, to reevaluate what your process was like and make this into an iterative process, one that is consistently amended and kept up to date. Because as you go on, as you learn, you will be learning from every client that you interact with in that process. And it's important to adopt new methods or new information, or even what you've seen or gotten feedback from either a not so successful attempt at an interview, all of these are learning opportunities, and this has to remain an iterative process in order for you to build a methodology of your own that works for the clients that you serve, as well as it just needs to be a living process that changes with the different clients you have and allows you the best opportunity to get what you need to get done, as well as serve your client to the best of your ability.
Great point. And I would even add to that, that part of that revisiting and reevaluating can even be information sharing among colleagues and each other. Hey, Lindsay talks all the time. Lindsay, I think you just said recently, like one of the best perspectives you got as a very experienced advocate was sitting in a room, like hearing people talk to their clients and learning tips and pointers from that. I think sometimes just the team going back and collectively reviewing, what did we do really well? What maybe could we have done different? What could we try differently to improve that approach can be a really effective way to continue to evaluate and improve. So thanks for that addition. You have officially reached the halfway mark of our presentation today. So for those that are joining us for CLEs or are here and excited to be here and also just getting CLEs as an added bonus, I do have the CLE code for today. We are going to use NVR, like Network Victim Recovery, NVR 519, today's date. I'm going to say that one more time. Lindsay's put it in the chat there. Your code, only one that you will need for your CLEs today, is NVR 519. All right, so we're moving into the last part of our discussion where I said we're going to spend, a good focus of our time together today. And as we shift from that macro trauma-informed approach to representation to really more of a micro consideration of the interview process, there are these kind of 6 hallmarks that were produced by the CDC in collaboration with the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care that are really considered required principles to create trauma-informed experiences for clients. And again, this kind of focused on the healthcare context, but can be really helpful in application within legal services. Lindsay, Lowell, feel free to jump in at any point in the next 5 slides if you want to add anything. I'll just start out framing us up. We know that safety is very closely tied to the second pillar of trust and transparency. That's both physical and psychological safety, thinking about what we need to fully show up as our full selves. This is so closely tied to trust and transparency because we do not want helpers, the lawyers, the intake staff, to make promises that we can't keep. This is so tied to safety because if we can't be trusted, then the brain may be telling, again, that cycle of trauma and isolation is that when we're not perceived as trustworthy, we may not have opportunity to build the same relationship with the client that really a fully trusting attorney-client relationship requires. There's this concept of peer support that I think often in talking to other lawyers, they're sometimes uncomfortable with it, but it's the idea that data and research has shown us that connecting with people with shared lived experiences and identities really allows us to collaborate, and it actually enhances our hope and trust, right? So resiliency, it helps us build resiliency. One of the just biggest moments in my work where I just had that like aha moment of why peer support is so valuable. And we just had a beautiful event where this survivor shared this publicly. She described being in a support group and how someone else said out loud something that only she thought she had felt. And when you hear someone say out loud something only you thought you knew, felt, or experienced, you feel understood. And just the value of feeling understood and validated as a trauma survivor, it's really important. And you may not be able to offer that as the legal support team, but the role that you play in this is knowing your partners who in the resources available in your community can offer that support structure that is really grounded in the important pillar of peer support. And this is very closely tied to the next one of collaboration. And what we mean by collaboration, even outside of the kind of external collaborations you might bring into your delivery of legal services, is thinking about the entire experience that a client has from start to finish. And this includes making sure that we are providing everyone on our team to be equipped to really provide trauma-informed experiences with our clients. One of the examples that Lindsay and I talk about all the time, and both have some pretty awful ones, is thinking about medical services, right? And I have this really, really distinct memory in my brain walking in to access medical care, and just the very first person at the desk was just not understanding the complexity. I didn't feel understood. I felt invalidated about the urgency of why I was there. And that person didn't have anything to do with the care I got later. That was amazing and great. But the very first interaction that clients have with our office, it sets the tone for how they expect other interactions with that team to go. And so collaboration internally is really, really important, that we're all on the same page about how clients will experience our entire partnership together in a trauma-informed way. And again, not surprising, we're going to create empowerment and choice. Clients are informed of every choice that they have. They are given accurate information about the potential consequences without making any promises that we can't guarantee, obviously. And they're given options for support and decision making. This is really key when we think about the principles that we learned about trauma responsive services from part 1 of the series. And this is also what Lowell was talking about as it relates to things like language accessibility. From a cultural and historical lens, we have to ensure that the service delivery is provided with philosophical understanding of cultural stereotypes, of biases, and that we incorporate practices that are responsive to the racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of every individual that we serve. And this recognizes and names the historical trauma of systemic racism, of oppression. Also, it requires that we have an awareness of our own identities when serving clients, and how those identities may impact various clients based on their lived experience. I don't know, Lowell or Lindsay, if you want to add anything else to these general principles before we forge on here. All right, hearing none, we're going to keep. Oh, Lowell, anything to add?
Yeah, just the last thing that I wanted to add to that great summary that you just shared is that a lot of these different elements they interact with one another. And so for many a times, for individuals, some of them, to build trust with them, you have to create a collaborative environment to be able to, better understand the historical and cultural lens that is applied to either their case or their personal experiences or their interaction with you. It's important to work with them to better understand who they are, where they're coming from, and what methods you can employ to connect with them on their level. And so it is going to take a lot of reflection on the self in terms of the practice. For many people, especially the what the legal system represents to them is different than what it is to other individuals. And so just beginning there, we can sit and talk for a very long time about how to approach that and how to address that as either a barrier or even as a means of facilitation. And so it really is a learning experience through and through. And as we, begin to learn more about how to, put inclusivity as well as, understanding at the base of the work that you all do, it's important to ensure that, this is an active practice as you go along, and recognize that these are skills that are lifelong and have to grow alongside you. So that's the one thing I can emphasize, because it's not a competency thing. It really is a lifelong learning opportunity.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's not like we wake up and every day we're like, oh, we got it right. In 100% of the places, I feel like having a growth mentality around being a trauma-informed lawyer, any profession that you're in, wanting to have trauma-responsive care requires ongoing work and education and practice, really, which is important. It's really helpful to know that our evolved understanding of trauma has changed not only how we prepare and respond to trauma responses in clients, but also how we better collect reliable data from the interview process. Some of you might be familiar with Russell Strand's FETI interviewing technique. That stands for Forensic Experiential Trauma Interviewing. We refer to it as FETI. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on it today. But if you are interested in learning more about the history and the development of FETI, we can share a resource in the chat here. I find it really fascinating, but really the key takeaway is to understand that the research on the neurobiology of trauma actually supports that the old interviewing technique that many of us were taught was really hallmark in investigation trainings for both police officers, other investigative roles like internal investigations, administrative investigations. It was called the Reed technique. And it's now found not to be reliable because how trauma memories are stored differently and not in our frontal lobe. And it really approached things expecting a linear chronological memory of events, which is not true for trauma memories, as we learned. But using these 7 steps that are outlined here, it is really recommended that when we use this FETI interviewing technique, we actually want to first collect the data that's about experiential feeling, right? So what are the things you do remember? How did it make you feel? What do you think about the way it made you feel? We want to capture all of these things before we even get into the who, what, where, when, why. Now, for lawyers that have been doing it, maybe more consistent with what we learned in the old Reed interviewing technique to identify gaps in memory or order, and then kind of hone in on that and see that as a potential credibility flaw. This is challenging because it means it takes a lot more time to get valid, reliable data when it's related to trauma memories, or even clients who have lived experiences and trauma histories, because we have to spend time hearing how it made them felt before we get into the details of what we really need. And while trauma memories are often not linear, but can sometimes present that way, this approach does allow for a more accurate and full narrative of trauma experiences that are more reliable. And again, not always chronological as we would have expected based off of how we were originally taught under the Reed interviewing technique, that people would present if they were not being deceitful. You know, I used the example when we met for our first part of the series about Rebecca Campbell's research around sticky notes. And it's just such a helpful illustration about when someone goes through a very hard traumatic experience, all of those memories are in the brain. But in the limbic system, where trauma memories are stored and recalled, the sticky notes are all messed up. It's not that the information isn't there, but the time it takes to pull them out and attach them in a order that makes sense of time and space is longer than our day-to-day kind of typical recall of memory. So the practical challenge here really is time, not only time for the lawyer and the team to prepare and to create the space to have, I love the sticky note analogy. And there, I can go off on it more, I'll get too distracted, but really what I'm saying is that as lawyers and as part of the legal team, this means we take a lot more time to roadmap, to do expectation management for the client before we even get into the interview. So they know what we're going to be asking of them and how long that could potentially take if we're building in the experiential data collection first before all of the details of the who, what, where, when, why. So we're going to do just a very kind of high level overview of the points that Lowell made about how do we prepare for the training, right? What are the things we want trauma responsive lawyers and support staff thinking about before the interview even starts? Road mapping, which I've mentioned, is a really important one. It's also a kind of organic way to create pacing, which means preparing clients for things that they know and you know are going to be difficult for them to talk about. We can roadmap for them. So we have 2 hours for the interview that we're going to have tomorrow. And if we don't get these 3 things that I need and these 3 things that you've identified you would like to get out of that, we've reserved another time slot the following week. And it takes a lot of time to roadmap and pace because you know the client might get to the hard part of the narrative and not necessarily be able to get into it in a way that they feel emotionally and prepared to do. And you got to plan for that. And so that road mapping technique can be really helpful for planning for how trauma and talking about acute trauma experiences can be really, really challenging. And trust is really tied to this process of building that psychological safety in the road mapping, which is the preparation for the interview itself. But really important key takeaway here is that we standardize everything. And this is as simple as being able to explain that we ask everyone about their pronouns, their chosen name, and we do that for everyone because we want to center what's important in our clients' identities and lived experiences. And when you standardize it, it really takes away some of the ways in which clients might respond to something, you know, and the response is coming from a place of thinking that you're making an assumption about them. Standardization is a really great way to make sure both that there's equity in how we approach our trauma-informed interview process, but that all clients experience them and us in the same way. And it's what we have explained is how they should expect to experience us. We do what we say we're going to do. And I'll talk about why this is so important in trust building. But you set your commitments with the client and then you keep them. And this can be really small things. Like at the very onset of that relationship, you identify what is going to make you, the client, feel most empowered and how frequent I share information with you. And if they say, hey, I know this is going to be a really long process and you might not have a lot of new or ongoing information, but every 2 weeks, I would just like to hear from you and get to know, is there anything new? We actually know that sticking to a frequency that is agreed upon between the attorney and the client, even if the response is, I have nothing new to tell you, but I just wanted you to know that, is a huge way to build trust in the attorney-client relationship. And again, takes a lot of time and calendaring and other sort of ways that you keep on task with that commitment that you've made with the client. During the interview, there are a few other key takeaways here. And one of the examples is, why do we explain why we're asking something or what the client should expect? One example that Lindsay often talks about is in the interview process with the forensic nurses that do forensic evidence collection, particularly for sexual assault, but also for domestic violence cases where we are. They will often explain that I might ask you about what parts of your body were touched. And the reason I'm doing that is that I would collect evidence from those body parts in different ways, depending on sort of what the best practice is. And if I explain up front why I'm going to ask you about that question, one, you're prepared to get it and you can prepare for that, especially if it's going to be a traumatic answer. But two, that there aren't assumptions being made about why am I being asked this? Is there something I did that they're asking me this? We see this come up all the time too, right? One of the examples as it relates to police and their interactions with trauma survivors, they often have to ask what a person was wearing. And this is not always related to sort of like what was the person wearing and did that cause the act that happened to them, which is very problematic in rape culture. But often they're asking because they're going to go look for video footage and they want to know what the actual clothing was the person was wearing so they can find the right video footage more quickly. But if the client doesn't know that's why someone's going to ask what they were wearing, the assumption could very well be there's some sort of judgment attached. And so the reason we explain why we're asking things up front is we eliminate the opportunity for the client to feel judged in a way that was not our intent. And of course, we're asking for permission, right? We're asking, is it okay if I'm taking notes? And that might impact my ability to make eye contact with you. We get permission that that's going to be a comfortable way to build trust and for the client to experience us during the actual interview. We ask about things like eye contact instead of assuming that everyone is comfortable with it or expects that from us. And we want to be really mindful about the questions that we ask. And I call this mind the questions, right? We'll talk specifically in another slide about questions and why they're so important. But as we move into the closure of the interview, these things seem so just like foundational. And when we say them out loud, it's like, yeah, of course I would do that. But there's lots of good evolving data about how stress impacts our memory. I was just mentioning this actually to my admin team yesterday. And what we know is that if we just imagine the moments we've been in really stressful situations, whether that's the medical setting, maybe the legal context, whatever it is, we might walk out of that experience not really remembering everything, not remembering to ask questions that we thought we were going to ask. And what we know is that it's really helpful in high moments of stress. It doesn't even have to be traumatic exposure or traumatic cues, that we reiterate what the plan is together, right? We review what happened, we talk about next steps. But for survivors and building trust with clients who have trauma histories, it's particularly important to honor and validate that they showed up and were able to have this interaction with you that's going to allow you to advance their goals and their interests. Overall, one of the most important things throughout the interactions with clients is that we are actively listening. And Lindsay knows that I'm a big nerd about this article that came out was featured in the Harvard Business Review. It's called What Great Listeners Actually Do. The reason I loved it is because it really pushed back on some of those old understandings that great listening is about being quiet and kind of nodding along. And it researched almost 3,500 participants, and it really contradicted this belief, and instead really said that good listening, active listening, is much more than being silent while a person talks. It promotes this collaboration and discovery. We can ask questions. If we've already gotten permission from the client, hey, can I ask questions during our conversation if I'm unclear? And they've said, yeah, that's great. Then it's okay to jump in and say, hey, actually, can I ask a question right there? As long as we've gotten permission to have that active collaborative communication with them in advance, this can actually build trust and confidence of the individual that we're in communication with. So again, don't try to just make it better. We talked about empathy versus sympathy in the video that we watched last time. Really knowing to be aware of your assumptions and the associations that you might be going to that are more about filling in your own gaps, and instead of just asking the client for clarification. And that's why minding the questions is so, so important. And what we always try to do is make a plan up front with our clients about how they want us to address questions that we have. Do you want that done in the moment, or do you want us to get through the whole narrative and then come back with questions? And then we honor how they're going to best experience us having to get clarity. We explain why we're asking. This is really important in the context of things like sexual violence, right? So when I have to ask the difference between a penile penetration versus a digital assault, if I don't explain up front that there's a legal difference and why the question and the answer is important from that perspective, asking that question alone without any explanation could really convey minimization, right? Saying things like, are you saying you were just hit once, really conveys just that that's not that big of a deal, that other people have it worse. So being really mindful about the wording we use when we're asking the question, and empowering the client to let us know, hey, did I miss anything? Are there questions I'm not asking that you think are important gaps that I need to fill in? And really giving them, again, the opportunity to control how we even get clarity from them in and after the interview process. Just generally on trauma-informed language, I think a key takeaway here, particularly if you work for child survivors, if you've gone through the child first finding words training, we mirror the language of the incident that individual client is using. This is also really helpful with adults too, right? If we start to use a different term about how they're referring to their trauma exposure, they might feel like they're not using the right language, or that there's a judgment in how they're talking about it, and they may shut down. So being really understanding of how we mirror the language of clients. Some big tips that Lindsay has really taught me, and I actually flub on this one a lot in a story that I share. That's a really good example of trauma responses, but we often use and hear the word gentleman used in reference to trauma exposure. And it's the person that has often caused harm is referred to, if they're male identifying, referred to as a gentleman. And that's from a place of wanting to create distance, right? But when you think about the actual connotation of the word, the person hearing that, the person who's been harmed, does not often perceive that person as a gentleman. And so using that word can actually be quite offensive. Saying things like, at least, all of the ways that we see the silver lining of someone's really traumatic experience can be really harmful. And so being really conscious about those tiny little differences that might land on clients' experiences in a very different way. But we call the experience what the person is calling it. Trust building requires us to introduce ourselves, our pronouns, ask about someone's chosen name, again, standardizing all the ways that we honor the intersections of their identities and their lived experiences. These are just a couple of key recommendations as it relates to your policies and practices. I would say really deeply consider, if you haven't already, do you want a screening tool for every client and standardize it across your intake process that helps to identify trauma histories and exposures? This can be something like the adverse childhood experiences assessment. It can be just sort of 1 or 2 screening questions that you pull from the different resiliency surveys that are available, but really making sure that you are actively looking to identify clients who may present with trauma histories and how that could show up in the way that you want to support them. And we have some other recommendations here. I think one of the big ones is just, we need to be really conscious of the way that people think about respect, right? And what is respectful, professional? What are our expectations versus the client's? Really not insisting that a person make eye contact or have nonstop focus on us the entire interaction, allowing people who need the time and space to sort of be present, be in the space, whether that's, just sort of checking their phone occasionally or doodling, whatever it is, being really creative about how we can make clients as comfortable as possible in their interactions with us. Bottom line, you won't get it perfect every time. The most important thing we do to build trust is we recognize when we don't think we got it perfect, and we go back and ask for permission to try again. We actually create choice for our client when we go back, and Lindsay taught me this, and say, hey, I reflected on how I responded in that interaction, and I don't think it was my best. Would you give me the opportunity to try and respond differently now? Trust is biological, and we know about it from great researchers like Paul Zak. And at the end of the day, what we know trust is that it is believing the person who is trusted will do what is expected. This doesn't mean that we have a savior complex, but that we are honest about what we can and what we cannot achieve based on the realities in our experience. So that is a lot to think about as it relates to trauma interviews and intakes. I know that there's a Q&A. I'm looking over at the chat box. Lindsay, I'll kick it over to you in case I missed anything that you want to uplift as we move into the last minute that we have together.
We did get a question if the slides will be provided after the webinar.
They should be, correct, Anna? I think I'm getting that correct. I know Tanya and Anna are here as well.
Yep, they'll be available on our website a few days after the webinar.
Awesome. Well, again, I really appreciate everyone's time and attention. I'm happy to hang on a couple extra minutes if people want to share any more questions in the chat. Thank you for the positive feedback, and you'll of course get your evaluations. And if you are seeking CLE credit, you have the instructions on the 2 forms to submit in the code. And I really hope that many of you will join us for part 3 in this 3-part series. I'm sad it'll be our last time together next Thursday, but really excited to talk more about specific trauma-informed lawyering within the civil context and preparing clients for civil litigation. Thanks so much, Marissa. Others, I'm seeing some. Thank you, Lowell. Thank you, Lindsay. And of course, all the folks behind the scenes bringing this to you today. I hope everyone has a wonderful and great rest of the week and weekend. Thanks, Jennifer.
You did get one more question if the
Oh,
person is still here. They said, They asked if you have any suggestions on further reading materials to educate themselves.
Yeah, I don't know, Lindsay, if you were able to share the FEDI link. That is a good one. There's actually, just today, I came across an article, and I don't even remember what it was in, but it was about the part of our brain that fills in gaps, both visual gaps, but also sort of nonlinear memory gaps. And there's like 30 different parts of the brain involved in that filling in pieces of missing information with our own lived experiences and past histories. What it's teaching me is that a lot of how the brain is designed is just to predict future behaviors and responses based on our past behaviors and responses, which is fascinating. But the biggest thing is there's lots of new data and research coming out specifically about our evolution of neurobiology of trauma, things like the fawn response. We have someone on our board, Dr. Middle, who does a lot of research on the health impacts and consequences of unaddressed trauma. That's another really interesting space in the research when we think about clients' unaddressed trauma and how that shows up in their bodies, connections with autoimmune, just really complex ways that unaddressed trauma can impact our clients' lives. So yes, we'll continue to share resources. I know it was in the link that was provided for the packet. And if we think of others, we'll make sure we bring them into part 3 as well and can get those circulated for folks. But hopefully those are a few helpful things to think about. Oh, hey, Adelaide, I just saw you.
Bridget, you got another question about how do you approach or question an individual about the weaknesses in their case?
Lindsay, I know you have a good answer to this one. You're welcome to go first and then I can add to it.
So honestly, I think being upfront with the person, I think you want to be as direct as possible and you want to do it in a way that's kind. And most people's natural instinct is to avoid it because it's hard. But especially if you're in a case where they're going to be cross-examined or deposed, or someone else is going to be asking them questions, you really have to be able to say to them, like, there are going to be some hard questions. And I want to talk about the places where, you know, like, for example, I worked with a survivor who was sexually assaulted by a man. She then spent the night in the bed with him, got up and went to breakfast with him the next morning. There were a whole lot of reasons why she did that. And when it, you know, when talking to her about it, we had to have a very honest conversation. Like, if this goes to court, the way that people are going to perceive this is an X way. How can we talk about it? How can I help you to express what was going on in that moment about why you didn't feel safe to say no to go to breakfast with the person? So my thought is always to be as honest and kind and direct as you can be.
I think from a trauma responsive, like, how do we prepare the client for the challenges? Lindsay's exactly on point. Being kind is not about like sugarcoating things. It's about being direct and clear, right? And also putting direct and clear, accurate information so the client is fully empowered to make an informed choice about how they want to move forward. I think from a legal strategy perspective, my brain always goes to experts. We are not always as creative about experts to fill in the weaknesses, if you will, in trauma narrative, trauma behaviors. So I think about, you know, a case that we had where the individual survivor of a, you know, sexual assault was just very, very, as many of these cases are, a challenging case. And a few months after she experienced it, and it was one of the few cases that was caught on multiple forms of camera, there was video footage of it. She went to a concert, and the defense attorney raised like how this behavior was not consistent with someone who had been traumatized in the way she was describing and claiming. And so I think being prepared of experts in the country like Rebecca Campbell, others that we can bring in to talk about these counterintuitive trauma behaviors immediately post, like Lindsay described in her example. Yes, Judith Lewis Herman. Thank you, Lindsay. That's another great book. And also thinking creatively about how can we bring experts into the actual, if there is an active trial, to really put a counter narrative to some of those expected behaviors that are just not consistent with real experiences of our clients. Hopefully that's a helpful way of thinking about that really hard question to unpack. I don't know who asked it. I do see that someone has their hand up. Is that Jack? I don't know if Jack is still here. I think I can allow you to talk. Let's see if that works.
It's not me.
It's not. Oh, well, I just allowed you to talk. Sorry about putting you on the spot. Well, thanks everyone. If we're not seeing any, sorry about that, Jack. If there are any other questions, feel free to use the chat. And again, you'll have an opportunity to engage with us again. And our information is available in the contact of the slides if you want to reach out. We love talking about this stuff. So if there are things that pop out, feel free to reach out, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer and team, for all the help. We really appreciate it. We'll see you all soon.
Bye now. Bridget Stumpf.